I want to start by thanking you everyone for joining us today for the BEPS informational session for architects and designers. I hope all of you are doing well and staying safe out there. We'll get started shortly after I go over a quick couple of housekeeping issues. First off, I want to thank you again for being here today. We're going to start with an informational session and then break out into small groups, then report back into this main room here. Your questions and comments during the breakout sessions will help inform the chapter as we submit our comments to the draft rules. So your feedback is very, very valuable. Please do go ahead and keep your cameras off and your mics muted until we move into those breakout rooms. We will be recording the informational portion of this, and then when we gather back here into the main group, when our moderators report back. We will not be recording the breakout sessions. By participating in this webinar, you're granting your permission to be recorded in the main hall and for the recording to be distributed at AI and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. Last, if you have questions during the informational sessions for our leaders, go ahead and put those into the chat box and we'll address those as we go along. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay Falaska, Director of the Building Innovation Hub.
Katie, thank you so much for having me here with you today and for co-hosting this event with us. So as Katie said, my name is Lindsay Falaska. I'm the Director of the Building Innovation Hub. I'm also joined today by James Ball, VP of Business Development at McGran Associates, and Matt Praske, Director of Energy and Sustainability at Wash Reed. So we are here today to tell you about the latest regulatory changes affecting buildings in DC and what this means for you and your practice and your clients. So we'll dive into some of the specifics of these regulatory changes, what you need to know, how it affects you. So as Katie mentioned, please feel free to put any questions in the chat and we're going to answer them as we go, as we finish up different sections. Before we begin the discussion, I want to take a minute to just introduce the Building Innovation Hub, since we are a new entity here in DC, created specifically to support local building industry professionals navigate new building regulations and the district's green building and climate goals, while also balancing the market forces that are changing what is and will be considered business as usual. So the hub is here to support the local building industry and make it easier for everyone to own and operate and design and build better performing buildings. So we're here to help everyone meet current needs you have around regulatory changes, like breaking down the implications of the building energy performance standards. And our goal is to not just provide information about these topics, but also outline how and where they all connect and explain what options are available to you in order to address them. In order to do that, we are providing resources, tools, and educational events like this one to help you understand your role in ongoing building performance and energy consumption. And we're certainly here to help you overcome today's hurdles, but our job is also to help everyone consider the long-term implications of decisions and really to push everyone towards the innovative solutions that we will need to design, build, and operate better performing buildings. So with that background, let's get to the meat of the presentation. So we'll start with a brief high-level overview of what the building energy performance standards are as a concept and why the regulation was enacted in the first place. And then we'll take a deeper dive into the specifics of the regulation. So it's important to remember that what this is all about and the reason these regulations exist is to combat climate change. This is one way that we can all say, with what will eventually be data as concrete evidence, that our individual actions made a difference, and here's how. So DC has a vision to be carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. And there are a number of ways the city is working to meet those goals, one of which is looking at the building stock in DC. So since buildings account for 73% of the district's greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the amount of energy used in buildings is paramount in order to achieve the district's climate commitments. So the Building Energy Performance Standards, or BEPS, are a regulatory tool that the district is using to help meet its green building and climate goals. So what is a BEPS? A BEPS sets a minimum threshold for energy performance for existing buildings. So these thresholds or standards, you'll sort of hear me use those terms interchangeably, are based on and measured against a building's demonstrated energy performance as shown in their benchmarking data. So in DC, large building owners, so buildings that are larger than 50,000 square feet, have been benchmarking their energy and water performance for nearly a decade. Building owners are required to track energy and water usage for their buildings using what's called, it's a tool from US EPA called Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And then they report that data to DOE on an annual basis. So in addition to collecting information about energy and water usage, the tool also collects information about building size, property, use type, occupancy, both in density and in terms of like working hours or what's in the lease, and the percent of the building that is actually conditioned. So the tool then produces what's called an Energy Star score, which gives buildings a score from 1 to 100. So the lower your Energy Star score is, the lower performing your building is. The higher your Energy Star score is, the higher performing the building is. So under BEPS, the district aggregates individual building performance information or Energy Star scores per property type to establish a standard for buildings to meet. So let's look at the graph on the right. Like if you just pretend for now that DC has 10 office buildings or 10 multifamily buildings or 10 whatever property type we want to pretend. So as 10 office buildings in the entire city, all of these office buildings have naturally varying levels of performance. So the district then aggregates information about these individual buildings and uses that information to find the median level of performance for, in this case, office buildings. So if a building is performing better than the median for its property type, an owner is not required to take action under BEPS. If a building is performing worse than the median for its property type, an owner will be required to improve a building's performance. So buildings that do not meet the standard for their property type will be required to improve their performance and demonstrate it at the end of a compliance cycle through benchmarking again. More specifically, we have just entered into the first compliance cycle of BEPS, which started on January 1st. So buildings that do not meet the standard for their property type will have to improve their building's performance and prove it via benchmarking by January 1st, 2027. So it's important to note that the district will then reevaluate aggregated building performance during calendar year 2027. And it's quite likely that they will raise the level of performance for the next compliance cycle of BEPS. So this is why even if a building is performing relatively well now or close to the threshold, but above it, building owners will want to make sure to maintain or increase performance over time to ensure that they'll be performing better than the next threshold that's released. So a little bit of a soapbox. So on paper, this regulation is a requirement for a building owner and deals with regulating operating performance of existing buildings. But it's incredibly important to realize the role that the architect has and your responsibility for building performance. So as the architect, you're able to actually see a more holistic picture of a building, how the pieces and systems come together, how to phase work, and frankly, how to support your clients. So architects need to understand how preparing your clients for BEPS is an incredibly important value add, and literacy on the regulation and energy in general is imperative to stay ahead in the market right now. Compliance with BEPS and an understanding of building performance is no longer just the responsibility of an MEP engineer or the building management or operations teams. It requires everyone to take responsibility as part of it. So I'll pause there really quickly before getting into the specifics of the rules and ask Katie if there were any questions that popped up.
Not quite yet.
Okay. So the BEPS rules, let's get into some of these details. Over the last few weeks, DOEE has released draft rules and guidelines associated with BEPS and benchmarking, which is of course an important piece of this whole equation. Most of the critical pieces have been released for public comment, and some are still available for public comment as well, which is what Katie was referencing in the introduction. So what has been released is
I got the audio.
Is proposed updates to the benchmarking rules, the BEPS rules, a report written by the BEPS task force. So the task force was or is a stakeholder group, which is made up of members from the building industry who supported and provided insight during the BEPS rulemaking process. What has yet to be released is a BEPS guidebook, which will include commentary, additional details into specific requirements of each compliance pathway, how to request exemptions, delays of compliance, and reporting procedures. I just want to make a note that everything I'm about to say is technically in draft form, and some pieces are, other pieces are subject to change. So while we don't anticipate any like huge or major shifts, it's worth noting that all regulations should be thoroughly reviewed once they are actually finalized in the DC Register. All right, so first we'll take a deeper dive into the specific updates around benchmarking and BEPS. So as I mentioned, privately owned buildings over 50,000 square feet have been benchmarking their performance since 2013. So the updates to the benchmarking rules include provisions for smaller buildings to be required to do the same. So for example, actually starting this year, also on January 1st, buildings over 25,000 square feet are now required to benchmark this year's performance. And that size threshold drops down to 10,000 square feet in 2024. So the other big update in the benchmarking rules is the requirement for building owners to receive third-party data verification, starting for data submitted in 2023. And the reason DC has done this is because both building owners and BEPS, frankly, needs to rely on accurate benchmarking information. So a verifier must have an approved license and be independent of the owner's team. And I wanted to call specific attention to this, even though it seems really small, because one of the few licenses considered approved is a licensed architect and professional engineer. And because I think there are actually some PEs on the call as well, which is why I wanted to call attention to it. So while individually data verification is, really a small scope of work, it's also a chance to get in front of your clients and provide insights into their portfolio, and frankly can be used as a business development pipeline. So I think there's an opportunity here that might not have presented itself otherwise. And so I want to note that the public comment period for benchmarking has closed, but the finalized rules should be published to the DC Register soon. So with that, Katie, wanted to follow up to see if there are any questions before we go on to the BEPS rules, if there's anything about benchmarking that popped up.
Sure, we have one question so far. What the new standard will be for the next round, and for projects that do not qualify in this cycle, will they be required to qualify for the next cycle? I want to give everyone one more reminder. If you're not one of the team leaders right now, if you could go ahead and mute yourself.
If you could repeat the question, that would be great, actually.
Sure.
The standards were just released for the first compliance cycle of BEPS, and we don't know what the next set of standards will be until those scores at the end of the first compliance cycle are reevaluated to see where the new median is in the district.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So BEPS. So unlike the benchmarking rules, the BEPS rules are still open for public comment. And so I'll explain some of the details around the rules that have been released and what we know so far. I'm not going to go into incredible depth into the rules because there's a lot there, but I do want to provide a good high-level overview of everything that's included and sort of what the high-level takeaways are. So as I mentioned, what has been released are the proposed BEPS rules. So those rules actually include instructions for owners on how to comply with BEPS and which buildings are subject to the BEPS rules. And then also recently released were the standards, which are the median levels of performance with which the BEPS rules will apply. And you'll notice that for the BEPS rules, there's a big cross out. The OEE is planning to announce at the end of this week that there will be an additional 30 days for the public comment period for BEPS. So it's the deadline is not as close as we initially anticipated. So in terms of size thresholds, BEPS builds on the district's benchmarking program. So if a building owner is mandated to benchmark a property, the BEPS program applies to that building. So therefore, the first BEPS period will only apply to buildings larger than 50,000 square feet. Eventually, as we noted, buildings over 25,000 square feet and then over 10,000 square feet will be required to benchmark. So all of these properties will eventually be phased into the BEPS program. This is important to note because it means that any property you are touching, designing or building or renovating that is over 10,000 square feet will eventually be subject to BEPS and will be required to meet certain performance thresholds. So as we saw in the earlier slides, only buildings who do not comply or that do not comply with the standard will be required to improve their performance during that compliance cycle. There are 4 compliance pathways for owners to choose from. There's a performance path, which requires a reduction in site energy usage by 20%, but a building owner can choose to do so with whichever energy efficiency means are most suitable for their building or what maybe they already had planned anyway. There is a prescriptive path, which will lay out specific energy efficiency measures that would need to be completed. But the idea is that this list of measures would still equal the 20% or approximately equal the 20% savings found in the performance path, but it provides a more specific way to actually hit that target. The standard target path allows an owner to reach the standard for their property type. So for example, if an owner is really close to, but like just misses the standard for their property type, they can do some moderate improvements to just meet the standard. But as I noted before, the standards will increase over time. So take that into consideration as well. And then there is the alternative compliance path. So for buildings with special circumstances, owners can apply to work with DOE and eventually come up with an agreed upon compliance pathway. The first deadline to note associated with BEPS is that building owners whose properties do not meet the standard for their property type will have until February 1st, 2023 to choose a compliance pathway. So that's 2 years from now. It will go by fast. It means that building owners who need to improve their property's performance will need to come up with a plan kind of ASAP. And this is also a business opportunity for architects to help your clients think through potential building improvements and renovations and phasing to help make sure that they get to be compliant. So you, of course, want to help your clients become compliant because there are fines associated with non-compliance, and they are not insignificant.
My understanding is that we want to try to make this floor as flexible as possible.
Can mute. I'm just going to mute that person. Sorry. So these are the proposed maximum penalties that would be assigned for properties unable to comply by the end of a compliance period. So it's important to note that these are maximum penalties and would be reduced relative to how much a building's performance can actually be improved. So for example, if a building owner can meet 75% of a performance goal, the fine would be reduced by 75%. And there's way more nuance to that in the rules, but that's sort of a general principle of how the penalties could be reduced. The idea behind the penalty structure is that DOE really does want building owners to comply because they want to see energy savings. So the penalties are set in such a way that it should hopefully be cheaper for owners to comply with the building energy performance standards by actually improving their performance. Not to mention they also receive the value of said improved building performance. So other language that was included with the proposed rules is about reporting requirements, what happens during a change in ownership, how to apply for exemptions, and how enforcement will be done. Didn't necessarily want to get into the details of that here, but they are part of the ordinance if anyone wants more information about that. So it's important to note that what was also recently released were the standards that will be measured, that buildings will be measured against during the first BEPS compliance cycle. So I think this goes back to the earlier question. So for example, the standard for office buildings is an Energy Star score of 71, for multifamily housing, 66, hotel 54, and K through 12 schools, 36. So to know if a building is compliant, this standard is measured against a building's Energy Star score from 2019. So if a building's Energy Star score is above the standard for its property type, the building is compliant and an owner is not required to take action immediately. If a building's Energy Star score is below the standard, a building owner does not meet the standard and will need to improve its performance over the compliance cycle. And as a reminder, the thresholds will raise over time in future BEPS compliance cycles. So buildings that are at or very close to the threshold cannot just really relax and do nothing. They're not required to do anything, but they should maintain a steady pace of building improvements to get it to stay ahead of compliance. And so with that, I will pause for any questions specific to BEPS before we move on to the other pieces. Katie, were there any questions that came in?
Not quite yet.
Okay. So how this affects your practice, some things to think through. So will designing to the new building code guarantee that your building will be compliant with BEPS? Keep in mind that new buildings become existing buildings as soon as they're occupied. And if they meet the size threshold, will be subject to BEPS. So we did a quick study to see whether new buildings, so buildings that were built under the last energy conservation code and that started benchmarking in 2018 and 2019, if they would be compliant with BEPS. And the answer is more or less, it depends. The range was a bit bigger for multifamily housing than office buildings, but as you can see, just building to code is probably not enough. The other question that we looked at, considering DC adopted new codes this past or last May, if a building is built to the new 2017 energy conservation codes, will they meet the BEPS threshold? And the answer again is it depends. It's not a guarantee. And it also certainly doesn't guarantee long-term compliance with future BEPS cycles. So I do want to note that one of the resources that we have on our website is where, looking more specifically at the pathways for code compliance and with BEPS, looking at where DC's building code actually meets BEPS, if anyone wants a more technical analysis for that information. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is how to design with Energy Star and Energy Star scores in mind, because it's going to be important to help your client understand what targets they should set over time, what that means for actual performance, and to sort of track that as design progresses. So there is a tool that the US EPA put out called Target Finder that can be used throughout the design process. So it'd be really good for everyone to familiarize themselves with how to use that tool and best practices in using it throughout the process. And then also another hub resource that we have is BEPS targets for new construction. So it looks at how architects and engineers or designers can think about site EY, source EY, and Energy Star score throughout the design process. And lastly, I want to point everyone to the district has a public data visualization platform where all benchmarking information, all the buildings that benchmark, that information is publicly available. So you can actually go to this website and you can look at your past projects to see how they performed in 2019. You can see which of your clients' buildings are going to be above the threshold for this year or below it. But it's a good way to get a sense of, one, how your past projects are performing, and two, which of your clients might need some additional support. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Matt Praske, Director of Energy and Sustainability at Wash REIT, to talk about what clients are looking for as BEPS takes effect.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm glad to be participating in this discussion. I think as Lindsay made pretty clear, the BEPS program sets pretty substantial objectives with some potentially substantial penalties. So it does require quite a bit of cooperation and collaboration among all stakeholders here. So excited and happy to be participating in conversation with this group to help facilitate those collaborations. Lindsay, you can go to the next slide, please. So my role, as Lindsay mentioned, I oversee energy and sustainability for Wash REIT. We own multifamily, office, and retail properties here in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. So just two ways of thinking about what I want to talk about very briefly with you all today is just share my perspective on where we need help, right? I am Wash REIT's dedicated sustainability professional. There's one of me. Other organizations may or may not have in-house sustainability employees. And because of that, we need help, right? We look to our partners in the industry to assist us in making decisions and getting to a cost-effective path of compliance. And they really fall into two areas: identifying the opportunities to make the necessary improvements to comply with BEPS, and then identifying the resources to to assist with and help us make the case for those investments necessary to comply. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll talk about those opportunities. It is inherent in the BEPS idea is that we have to make improvements, right? In order to comply, there are some possibilities that we're making just behavioral or set points and schedule adjustments. But most likely, in order to hit the more substantial targets and for buildings further from the standard, we need to implement energy conservation measures, right? And as building owners, our ideal is to implement those things when other work or dollars are being spent in the building, right? We want to do things based on the natural life cycle of building events, not just for BEPS alone. So we want to be aware of and capture those windows of opportunity when that work is occurring to make sure we're doing whatever's necessary to comply with BEPS at that time, right? So in my mind, it's 4 or 5 major opportunities, right? We have our annual OPEX or work that's occurring. So routine maintenance and preventive maintenance, right? Make sure when that work is occurring, our teams are capturing opportunities. When we have unit turnover, right? Whether that's a resident or a tenant is moving in or out, we get vacant space, dollars are being spent. We want to make sure we're capturing that opportunity. And really that's the window of opportunity. We're often talking with our architecture partners, right? There's also property transactions, right? Building is bought or sold. We have underwriting. We're identifying capital budgets. There are those opportunities. We don't want to miss any of those opportunities. So that's one of the messages to our partners is flag for us when those opportunities are occurring, when those events are occurring, what opportunities we have to potentially impact the building's energy performance in a way we might not have otherwise considered. So for that reason, I note, and don't hold me to this, but maybe scope creep is sometimes good, right? When we have a particular space is vacant, or we are opening up a wall for something else, rather than often our pressure to our teams and our partners is, we need to get this done as quickly as possible, limit the scope because we want to get the project done in order to start rent, right? Get someone in the space. We may need, and we want everyone thinking a little more strategically, what if we slow down a little bit? What if we expand the scope because now we have this opportunity to access this space, access this piece of equipment, or fundamentally make a change to the space that will benefit us for BEPS and achieving compliance there, that we need to keep in mind separate from our sort of traditional motivating factors of time and budget. So with that in mind, we can go to the next slide as well. And that, what I wanted to list here is helping you to think about what role you can play in identifying and being the resource for the client, right? In many cases, we are the resource constrained as it comes to in-house energy or sustainability expertise. And so we look to our partners to provide that expertise for us, or to spark new ideas for us, right? We don't know necessarily how to get to compliance. And so we rely on outside support there to identify opportunities, to identify new ideas for us to consider. That's where I note, a database of similar properties or projects, right? Where we have existing buildings, we know we have data about our building. You may, within your portfolio, be able to point to a similar building or similar prior project or property from which we can learn. I think that is often one of the questions I get asked the most internally when we're evaluating something new is, where's this been done? Who's done it? Was it successful? To the extent you all are able to point to either work within your own portfolios or through your contacts, know of and identify those things and bring them to our attention, that's incredibly helpful. I also note rebates and incentives. Being the resource that is aware of and can bring to our attention rebates or other financial incentives to help us get these projects done is incredibly valuable. And most valuable when that's brought to our attention as early in the project as possible. It's unfortunately the case more often than not, we find out somewhat after the fact, hey, by the way, you did this thing. Did you know you can get a rebate for it? Which is great. We'll certainly take that money for the efficiency investment we made, but it didn't change the decision making, right? It didn't mean we did something more efficient or more innovative based on the dollars available. And that's really the goal of those rebate and incentive programs, right? Is to say, don't do business as usual, incrementally improve the efficiency, and we'll incentivize that. So that's where we look to our outside partners to be the experts in that and bring that to our attention. Next, I just want to put in your minds this concept of defensive value and a changing role for architects and other designers to play in helping the client understand the full value proposition of the work they're doing. Whereas traditionally we think primarily in this additive value, right, of energy savings being the return that you're seeing, and that's the only criteria on which to evaluate the project. With a program like BEPS, we want to keep in mind defensive value. What is the purpose? In some cases, we are justifying the project based on defending the asset value, or defending against future regulatory expense, or defending against future insurance increases. That's more in the concept of designing for climate resiliency. But what are those other concepts that we need to understand? And we want to make sure all of our stakeholders involved are aware not just of the sort of short-term returns of efficiency investments, but starting to think through and understand projects and decision-making through these ideas for the dollar values that you saw Lindsay present in terms of what the maximum penalties could be. The return may be entirely in protecting the overall asset value and our ability to transact that, right? And then finally, serving as the resource to streamline our compliance. I think you'll find Lindsay, rightfully so, went pretty briefly through the rules so far, but as you learn more about them and as we dig into them more, there are potentially significant requirements, and we want to make sure the lesson here is to be the resource to streamline that compliance burden. They're particularly for buildings pursuing the prescriptive path, where they have to provide reports, analysis, and documentation on what projects have been implemented, be fully aware of what those are, and be able to deliver a clean submittal package that aligns with what the DOEE reporting requirements are, such that that's not an additional burden on the owner in achieving compliance. So those are a few ideas to share with you all on sort of what's top of mind for us in terms of what we're trying to be prepared for and what we think we need from our partners in supporting us in reaching compliance. So I leave you with that, and then interested to sort of hear more discussion as we continue.
Thank you very much for that perspective, Matt. It's always helpful to hear what the clients in the district are looking for as this stuff takes effect. So before we kick it over to James, I just want to ask Katie, I saw there were a bunch of questions that popped up in the chat. And so I just wanted to clear up any of those before we move on to James's portion of the presentation.
Sure, it looks like we just have two. The first is the BEPS compliance threshold mapped to the ZEPI score?
I defer. I don't know the answer. It sounds unfamiliar to me. Does anyone else, anyone else have an answer? We can always follow up offline. James, you're muted.
Okay, how about now?
Hey, Lindsay, I can say. Can you hear me?
Yeah, short answer is no, right? The portfolio manager, in terms of its inputs, is a different algorithm than any other score. It's unique. So really, BEPS evaluation is its own metric to look at and doesn't comply directly to code or ASHRAE or HERS or ZEPI, to my knowledge.
All right, thanks, James. And then the second question we have the cost to owners for implementation for BEPS been estimated yet?
There was a cost benefit analysis that the team at Stephen Winters actually did. To my knowledge, it has not been finalized yet. So that is something that the district is looking at, is that cost benefit analysis of what it means to comply with BEPS under the different pathways. But I have not seen that yet, nor do I think it's quite been finalized, or it's still sort of in the final draft form.
All right, great, thank you.
All right, and with that, I will kick it over to James Ball, the Vice President of Business Development at McGran Associates, to talk about the business opportunities of BEPS.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, and thank you, Matt, as well, for giving that perspective. Let's go straight to the next slide, because this is the business opportunity in numbers. And if you haven't gotten the idea already, this is significant, right? This is a major shift in both how we do business and new business to be had. So this is the actual data on all the buildings within this first cycle. Now, clearly only half of these are going to be out of compliance and have to do something. But as I'll argue in a minute here, all of these buildings need to at least be aware of or be considering BEPS. And furthermore, this doesn't take into account the new buildings coming online, both with new construction, as well as the next cycle coming in at 25,000 square feet and above. So needless to say, there's a lot of buildings out there of all different types that are going to take our services to comply. So for an owner, this might be kind of a challenging business idea. For architects, engineers, energy service providers, this is just work. This is opportunity to do more services for our clients and in a better way. The break apart, as you can see, predominantly multifamily and then offices. That office does include banks and some other things in it. And at McGran, we specialize in multifamily housing. So we're excited to be working with all of you to take advantage of this. And the last point I want to make is we all are in this together within DC. The competition we have is with other firms coming in to do this, right? If you don't feel prepared to service your clients with BEPS, please reach out to me, reach out to somebody else that can help you get that training, because we have a lot to gain as a local service market of architects, engineers, and other professions in helping our local developers comply and do this locally here. So we don't have to go to the West Coast and bring in those firms to have experience in complying with standards like this. We're all in this together to make this a success. So on the next slide, we'll kind of look into that in more detail. I've taken a multifamily specific example here just to dive into the details. On the top right, you'll see kind of a box and whiskers distribution of actual energy performance in multifamily buildings for 2019 data. And that same graph is on the horizontal kind of histogram there into those same quartile buckets. And the point that I want to make here, and Matt really opened up this conversation to say, what this looks like for each building and building type is gonna look different, right? If you're in the bottom 25% of performing buildings, you need to be considering most likely a larger scope of work, a more comprehensive view. There's more opportunity in those buildings to improve energy efficiency. That model, that service scope, is different from buildings that are closer to the line and might be able to come into compliance through more of a operations and maintenance strategy, right? If you view this kind of over time, some of these are going to be spikes in performance. Some of them are going to be more gradual improvements over time. How this works, what this looks like, this is up to us to figure out. This is kind of our innovation and our expertise. At the end of the day, BEPS just cares about that you got there. How we do it cost effectively, adding value to these assets, that's us to figure out. So this is one way that I was thinking about it, of these different quartiles of how far you have to go. And I think that the other point I want to make here is those buildings that are right above the standard, that are technically in compliance, watch your rear, right? The next cycle, the standard is likely to go up and you will be out of compliance. And clearly it is more cost effective to stay in compliance than to fall in and out of compliance. So as I was saying to somebody else, that all buildings are going to have to deal with BEPS. Some buildings are being forced to do so because they're out of compliance. But really, no matter where you are, you need to be considering BEPS as a part of your approach to your next project. And even that top 25%, okay, you're safe for now, but you want to stay in that top leadership position so you can continue to have a low risk in compliance performance going forward. So let's go to the next slide. And I think from here, I just want to give a couple really tangible examples of what this service model looks like here. We've already gotten these calls at McGran. We do both MEP engineering and energy services. So we're getting this call. And so for those of you that haven't dealt with this yet or are thinking of making that call, most likely the typical package, right, for an existing building that says, hey, I need to comply with BEPS, is going to start with a look at the data. And this is important for two reasons. One, that data may or may not be accurate. Verifying that that data is accurate is a critical first step, right? These inputs that go into that benchmarking score, there's quite a few of them. And really making sure you have the right score is where we begin. Furthermore, we can learn certain things from that data, right? By disaggregating it, looking at heating and cooling loads versus other use types within the building, we can start to understand the energy profile of the building. Now, clearly, to take this to the next level, we need to get on site. And this can be a comprehensive physical needs assessment. This can be strictly an energy audit. But by viewing the actual systems, we can look for those low-hanging fruit as well as that kind of comprehensive approach. This stage is also going to include an energy model. We're going to do some return on investment calculations, help you select the energy conservation measures, or ECMs, that you will need to get into compliance, right? So that audit report is really your map, your guidebook. And I just have to like double down and say, please don't just kind of stab in the dark of where you should invest your money in terms of energy efficiency. That energy model, that roadmap is critical to achieving that outcome. Clearly, we go into a design stage. Design is more than speccing the equipment. It's sizing it correctly. It's making sure we're not creating any moisture issues or comfort or health issues within the building. Properly doing that design is critical to success, as is the install, right? The best plan, the best design will not work if it's not installed correctly. You all know this very well. That quality assurance check, that construction administration is a key element to the process. And perhaps most important of all is it's all for naught unless we actually get the energy improvement. The measurement and verification stage to show the results is at the end of the day what BEPS is going to measure. And if that doesn't hit home, you know, one of the worst case scenarios here is you did everything right. You installed it, you did the measures, you did your best, and you get to that final check and your performance didn't actually get to the number and you've received a fine. So measuring, staying ahead of this is all part of a risk-averse and cost-effective strategy. So on the next slide, I want to show that this is a kind of narrow view of that business opportunity, but we have this opportunity at all stages of a project. So this is my kind of visualization, forgive the kind of simple idea of it, but I just want to say that across the life cycle of a building, we all can be improving performance and setting ourselves up for long-term improvements of performance, right? So design is not just putting in the specs of the equipment that will go in at that first stage. It's designing so that future improvements future renovations and replacements can happen cost effectively as well, right? An obvious point there is, hopefully you've only installed and designed a wall once in the entire life of a building. That's why we need to invest in high performing envelopes, airtight construction, quality assurance before you put on your drywall, because that's going to be critical to that long-term performance. The circles at the bottom, just to kind of explain this visualization, are meant to symbolize that the smaller circles are happening more repetitively and are lower cost investment. And we should start there in terms of building performance. As we go to the outer circles, the outer rings, that's more time, more money spent to do performance improvements. So all of these are touches, as Matt was describing. All of these are a window of opportunity to make sure your building is on the path to high performance and compliance with BEPS. Next slide. This final slide, or two more slides here, to just give some key takeaways for you all as you head away. Oh, I think we skipped one there. The key bullet points to say are, one, that performance should be something you consider now in all projects. It's a new kind of standard criteria, thank you, that you're going to have to take into consideration. The way to assess that performance is through data, right? Data is both a decision-making tool, and in this case, it is the measurement of if you have passed or failed. Use that data throughout your process, integrate that so that you can stay on track to that performance outcome. Energy modeling is the tool to both input and then output that data and see if you're on track. If you're not including energy modeling early in your design process yet, please consider starting to use it both as a target setting, as Lindsay described, that target setting tool, as well as the decision-making tool and tracking to actually stay on target. It's a critical part of the process. And finally, I hope this will really lead into the discussion in a minute, is those roles and responsibilities, right? At the end of the day, architects are the quarterback, right? You guys are gonna, at some level, hold some responsibility here. How that exists in writing, if you pass that on to others, and how you work with your team to integrate this is gonna be a big part of the success. Last point on this last slide I wanna make is that performance is more than just reducing energy. We can create energy efficient, quote unquote, buildings by making them cold and dark, and nobody will want to live in them. We have to improve performance more holistically while reducing energy, and we can do that. We've been doing that for 35 years at McGrath, right? We know as an industry what this takes. But looking at this holistically, and this is for your firm to decide how you present this, how you talk about, how you create value as performance is a concept. Health, comfort, beauty, desirability, right? That emotional connecting to buildings. We can do that at the same time as BEPS. And if we're successful in that, we all have something to gain, because the DC real estate market will gain a competitive advantage. We will attract businesses, we'll attract investors, we'll attract tenants. There'll be more business for us. And as a nation leading example of this, we'll be the ones getting invited to other cities when they start to incorporate this. And it is going elsewhere as well. So a lot to gain from doing this right. Really excited to hopefully work with many of you on this going forward. And with that, I think we'll move into discussion.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that impassioned ploy for the role that the architects have and the potential business opportunities that this really does present. And so with that, I want to kick it over to Katie to facilitate the breakout group discussions about the rules, the regulations, and everything we just discussed.
Sure. So I'm about to open up the breakout rooms. You guys will be in there for about 20 minutes. You'll each be in with a moderator or two who will be posing a few questions just to drive the conversation. And then your moderators will report back here in this main room after we're all done. So if you have any questions, you can always, for me specifically, you can pop back into this main room. And otherwise, I will see you all in 20 minutes.
Hello, multifamily room.
Oh, James, you're still in with me. Let me see if I can move you.
Huh.
You should have a prompt. All right, those of you that are still in this room with me, I didn't get a response about what room you wanted to go into. So I can either randomly assign you, or you can chime in and let me know where you'd like to go, stick it into the chat, and then I can move you into a room.
What are the options?
Multifamily housing affordable, market rate multifamily housing, commercial projects, and then kind of a catch-all for retail, hospitality, education, and healthcare.
Matters. And there was an overall kind of nervousness about, you know, do we have the education and training we need? You know, this kind of changing standard of practice for architects. You know, for some of them coming out of school more recently, it's like, look, we didn't cover this. You know, this is kind of some new things we're being asked of, and you know, want to make sure that we're prepared to do it, recognizing how we do it, right? I think that was a really great point. Like, we have to do this now. The question is how. You know, and that can make or break it, especially as one example, how we communicate this to owners and developers, speaking their language, right? Making sure it's conveyed in a way that they can understand and work with is all an important piece. Those are some of our main topics.
Great, thank you. And now we'll go on to market rate multifamily.
Sure. So we had some great discussion, some of it just sort of general and not necessarily specific to the market rate multifamily sector, but a few items there. I think one of the, so I'll just sort of run through a handful of highlights here. First, we noted one of the challenges is always in convincing the clients that what architect may be communicating as required is indeed required. And can be particularly challenging if that owner or client is not DC based, right? In many cases, there are properties here where the decision maker isn't. And so if they're not familiar with BEPS, that education component to assist them in making a decision is a challenge. Plenty of discussion around whether or not we are currently equipped with the information and the tools to assist clients in making long-term decisions, right? Can we, and therefore some nervousness about what is represented in the decision from an architect or designer of what the future performance of that building is going to be. So do we have the tools necessary to understand what future thresholds are going to be in subsequent compliance cycles, and whether or not the buildings will comply? Do we have the tools necessary to understand what the financial penalties will look like under different scenarios? I think it was a great comment. It said, the more data-driven this process becomes, at BEPS, clearly the presentation from Lindsay saying this is very data-driven. The more data-driven that process becomes, the more data will be expected to provide to clients, right? So, you know, there's some sense of certainty of what these performance numbers look like. Can that be matched with some similar certainty in the data on future performance and what those penalties may look like in order to allow clients to make informed decisions? And great points about how needing more information or more solutions on bringing these critical decision points to the front end of the project. So whether in many cases the experience is that clients put off those decisions early on, but they're focused on getting increasing the unit count within the building or other things that are high priority for them. So how does the architect or designer highlight and make urgent the critical decisions that will be impacting BEPS very early on in the process? And then one last thought is the challenge around cheap energy, right? It was comforting to hear from some designers who said, we can do it. We can design to near or net zero or near net zero. The technology is there, we have the capability. But if the cost signals either to the owner to make the decisions for those things or to the tenants or residents who are paying relatively cheap electricity or natural gas prices, don't provide them the signals to operate to those designs, then we're at a loss. So. that's what we had. It was a good discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Now we'll move on to Marshall and Emily with commercial projects.
Right. So we did, just before we got into the questions, we took kind of the temperature of the room to understand how familiar everyone was with the policy. And it seems like we had a good mix in our group of people who weren't that familiar with it and others who were, very, very familiar with it. The big concerns were around cost and what it's going to do for the DC real estate market. Is it going to make it too expensive, or will people not want to buy or build here for this reason? We also talked about how we'll be using energy modeling, audits, and metering more in the future, how that's going to become more necessary. And then to talk around talk about the indirect accountability question, I think that the sense is everyone's going to be having conversations in their offices about how to approach it. Mm-hmm. There might be one right size answer for this, but it's going to impact our professional liability. There was a request that maybe DCAIA can work with attorneys to identify reasonable expectations for around targets. So. Do you want to add anything to that, Marshall?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of things. It was a really great discussion. I think one thing I'll add, we had a couple owners in the room as well. And one thing that's making them really nervous is sort of the recurring nature of the cycles and the uncertainty about future compliance. And the question of whether you can get someone to guarantee the achievement of a score or EUI level. And we had some other people saying in the room saying that for engineers and architects, they aren't responsible for project operations and can't be made responsible for that. So there was some back and forth there. A lot of discussion about the need for owner education and smaller owners with smaller portfolios not really paying attention or being aware. Definitely some concern about making it harder to sell buildings and exposure for the DC market, but then on the flip side, we had discussion about how Montgomery County may be doing this, other jurisdictions will be doing this, and how this maybe lifts all boats in DC as well. Some good conversation about various tools, energy modeling and so forth, sub-metering for both major equipment and for tenant levels as a way of sort of understanding sort of where are the issues for a building that has problems. And then finally, one thought that came up several times was the question of, how do you guarantee compliance? How do you guarantee permanent compliance? And I'll just offer a thought here, which is that, a net zero energy or net zero energy ready building more or less represents, you can't actually truly use no energy. So net zero energy more or less represents the most you can get. And one thing we've had conversations in the task force, so I don't want to speak for DOE because this isn't in the rules, but the possibility that there may be some sort of carve out that a net zero energy building could be considered permanently in compliance, because it would be unrealistic to expect a net zero. If most buildings in DC at some point in the future were net zero energy, it would be unrealistic to expect half of them to cut their energy use further. So, I was pleased to hear someone talk about that as a possible approach, because I would definitely echo that.
Okay, great. Thank you both. And then Lindsay, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Our group hit on many of the same topics that other folks have mentioned. So we were the smorgasbord of retail, hospitality, healthcare, education, but folks on the group also indicated they also do the other segments or sectors as well. So a big part of what we actually discussed about was the upfront work for architects and the changing role and what that means at the beginning of a project in terms of how an owner or how an architect is getting in front of their clients or in front of the building owners and getting this information to them up front. So it means, one, making sure that architects have the scope within their budget to do so, that they are trained to be able to speak in an eloquent way about energy related topics and specifically the law. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to ensure that architects or architecture firms have the in-house expertise they need to be able to facilitate those conversations, knowing that, during the feasibility or concept phases, those outside consultants who typically handle this type of work are not usually brought in. So how to basically upskill architects for that early phase to make sure that the skills are in-house or can be brought in soon enough, either via scope or just in-house expertise otherwise. There was lots of discussion too, very similarly about balancing sort of upfront costs and long-term considerations, which is always the battle for sustainability in general. So how to get clients to think beyond just what the first upfront cost is. And I think that goes to what Matt was saying in his part of the presentation of like how to sort of potentially expand scope now to reduce future risk, and helping clients frame and think through those ideas. We also talked about tools and resources that are needed. So design tools so that architects feel comfortable and confident in talking to clients about not just BEPS, but about energy. How to help designers use tools like Target Finder, because they might not be able to rely on an MEP engineer at the project outset, and generally understanding various terms and how to use them with owners. And similarly to what one of the other group leaders said, which is the type of contracts that are used. And so how are an architect's contracts or proposals protecting them from compliance in the future if they didn't sort of explicitly state you will hit X or Y. And so what types of legal documents are in place or could be in place to help protect the architecture community from items related to ongoing building performance.
All right, great, thank you. That is a lot of very good information, especially for us at the chapter. I want to take just a couple of minutes to see if anyone else has any questions they want to put into the chat that we can post to our leaders here. And otherwise, Lindsay, do you have any wrap-up words you want to share?
So just to reemphasize, if people are interested in providing comments to the rules, comments are due on March 4th. People can submit comments individually. You can email comments. That information is also online as well for people who want to copy it. You can also hard mail in comments. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, but email is, of course, a really great opportunity to do this. And then the other thing that's open for public comment for just a few more days are the actual standards, if people want to provide comments to the actual standards. So those are due by January 31st. And lastly, I just wanted to say thank you for having us. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about BEPS. I know hearing about changing regulations is not always the most interesting of topics in terms of the legalese of it all, but I appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about the regulation, how it's going to affect the entire DC market, and the role of the architect in the process. So please do check out the hub. Feel free to go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, and let us know what other resources we can provide to be most helpful to you all. And Katie, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to wrap up with.
I just want to echo thank you to everyone for coming today. Thank you to our moderators as well. If anyone has any follow-up thoughts or anything that comes to mind after we close out this discussion today, please feel free to email me at education@aiadc.com. And I'd be happy to either field your questions, put you in touch with resources, or add your concerns to our chapter comment. So thank you all again, and we will all be in touch.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.